The crisp, heavy paper of the receipt felt like a razor blade against Cedric's thumb. It was 2 a.m., the London rain bleeding down the study window, blurring the neon signs of Soho below. He had only been looking for a pin in Edelin's designer trench coat. Instead, he found a neatly folded piece of evidence from the Archer Hotel. Suite 402. 2 nights. Vintage champagne. The dates aligned perfectly with her supposed solo riding retreat in the Cotswolds. The silence of their luxury apartment suddenly felt deafening, heavy with the weight of a meticulously crafted lie. Cedric didn't scream. He didn't wake her. As a film producer, he knew that the most devastating scenes required patience, precise lighting, and perfect timing. The script of their marriage had just been rewritten, and he was about to become the director of her downfall. If stories of dark secrets, calculated revenge, and the heavy price of betrayal speak to you, stay with me. Let's watch this scene unfold together. The rain in London always seemed to carry a specific kind of melancholy, but tonight, it felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket over Soho inside the sprawling, minimalist apartment that Cedric and Edelin shared. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of water against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Cedric stood in the dimly lit foyer, the shadows contouring the sharp angles of his exhausted face. He was 38, a film producer whose life was dictated by schedules, budgets, and the delicate egos of actors. He was used to managing chaos. He was not used to the cold, creeping sensation of dread that was currently settling into his stomach. Edelin was asleep in their master bedroom down the hall. She had returned just hours ago from what she claimed was a 3-day, secluded riding retreat in the Cotswolds. To polish the third act, she had said, kissing his cheek with a smile that, in retrospect, hadn't quite reached her eyes. She had been exhausted, citing writer's block and the damp country air, and had fallen asleep almost immediately after a glass of wine. Cedric had only been looking for a pen. He needed to review the latest budget margins for their upcoming feature film, The Glass Facade, a project that had consumed their lives for the past 2 years. Edelin's beige Burberry trench coat was draped carelessly over the armchair in the study. Cedric reached into the deep pocket, expecting to find one of her heavy, silver fountain pens. Instead, his fingers brushed against a crisp, folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. It wasn't a script page. It wasn't a cafe receipt. The gold embossed logo at the top caught the dim light from the desk lamp. The Archer Hotel. Cedric's breath hitched. The Archer was an ultra-exclusive boutique hotel in the heart of Mayfair, known for its discretion and exorbitant prices. It certainly wasn't a rustic cabin in the Cotswolds. His eyes scanned the black ink printed on the thick paper. Guest, Edelin Vance. Room, Suite 402. Check-in, Friday. Check-out, Sunday. Charges. Room rate, room service, vintage Dom Perignon. The dates aligned perfectly with her retreat. 2 nights. A suite. Champagne. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Cedric stared at the paper, the letters blurring as his heart began to pound a slow, erratic rhythm against his ribs. His mind, trained to analyze scripts and identify plot holes, immediately began to connect the dots. The late-night texts she claimed were from their lighting director. The sudden changes in her wardrobe. The faint, unfamiliar scent of a musky cologne that he had caught on her skin weeks ago, which she had dismissed as a crowded elevator encounter. He felt a physical ache in his chest, a hollow tearing sensation. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of building a production company, fighting industry sharks back to back, sharing everything from their bank accounts to their deepest artistic insecurities. Who is it? The question echoed in his mind, toxic and sharp. He didn't march into the bedroom. He didn't scream or throw the Waterford crystal glasses against the wall. That was how amateur characters reacted in poorly written melodramas. Cedric was a master of the slow burn. He carefully folded the receipt exactly as he had found it. He opened his phone, snapped a crystal-clear photograph of the document, and then slipped the paper back into the pocket of the trench coat. He walked slowly to the doorway of their bedroom. In the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds, Edelin looked peaceful, Her dark hair fanned out across the white pillows. She looked like the woman he loved. She looked like a stranger. Cedric leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. The profound emptiness settling inside him was rapidly freezing over, crystallizing into something hard, sharp, and intensely focused. The production of The Glass Facade was entering its final, most critical casting phase tomorrow. Eadlin would be there, and so would the rest of their team. He would watch. He would wait. He would find out who the co-star in his wife's private tragedy was. And then, he would cancel them. The production office on Dean Street was a study in controlled chaos. Sunlight filtered through the large, industrial windows, casting long shadows across the exposed brick walls and the massive oak conference table. It was 10 in the morning, 8 hours since Cedric had found the receipt from the Archer Hotel. He sat at the head of the table, an untouched black coffee resting near his meticulously organized notes for The Glass Facade. His posture was immaculate, his expression the picture of a focused, demanding producer. Inside, he felt like a hollowed-out shell, his every nerve ending completely electrified. Eadlin sat to his right, radiant and seemingly rejuvenated. The country air of the Cotswolds, or rather, the vintage champagne of Suite 402, had given her a subtle, glowing flush. She was animatedly discussing the character arcs with the director, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke. Cedric watched her with a cold, detached fascination. It was like watching an actress deliver a flawless performance on the first take. Then, the glass door of the conference room swung open, and Vesper walked in. As London's most sought-after casting director, Vesper possessed an aura that demanded immediate attention. He was sharp, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that defied the usual casual attire of the Soho film crowd. He moved with a predatory confidence, dropping a thick stack of headshots onto the table before taking the seat directly opposite Eadlin. "Morning, everyone," Vesper said, his voice a smooth, gravelly baritone. "I've narrowed down the final callbacks for the lead. I think we need to pivot our perspective." Cedric did not look at the headshots. He looked at his wife. The shift in Eadlin was microscopic, invisible to anyone who had not spent the last 7 years memorizing her every habit. Her shoulders, previously relaxed, suddenly squared. She sat up half an inch straighter. The easy, conversational smile vanished, replaced by an intense, almost breathless focus directed entirely at Vesper. "Pivot how exactly?" Eadlin asked, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. As Vesper leaned forward to explain, his forearm rested on the table, inching closer to Eadlin's space. He reached out to tap a specific photograph on her iPad. For a fleeting second, the cuff of his tailored jacket brushed against her bare wrist. Eadlin did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into the proximity, closing the physical gap between them by a millimeter. It was an unconscious gravitation, the undeniable magnetism of two people who had recently shared a bed. Then, the final piece of the puzzle drifted across the oak table. As Vesper shifted his weight, the air currents in the room shifted with him. A faint, distinct scent reached Cedric. Bergamot, crushed tobacco leaves, and a heavy, musky undertone. It was the exact same cologne Cedric had smelled on Eadlin's skin 3 weeks prior. The scent she had smoothly blamed on a crowded elevator ride at the British Film Institute. Cedric's hand tightened around his pen under the table, the plastic casing groaning slightly under the pressure. The realization hit him not with an explosive bang, but with a slow, agonizing slide of a cold blade. It was Vesper, the man they had fought the studio to hire, the man who held the power to shape the entire cast of their masterpiece. Vesper was not just sleeping with Cedric's wife. He was embedded in the very foundation of their livelihood. "I think Vesper is right," Eadlin said softly. Her eyes locked with the casting director's for a second too long before turning to her husband. "Cedric, don't you agree we need someone with a harder edge?" Cedric looked at his wife, then at the man who was quietly dismantling his life from the inside out. He forced the muscles in his jaw to relax, summoning every ounce of professional discipline he possessed. "Let's see the auditions," Cedric replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I want to see exactly what he brings to the table." The projection screen dominated the darkened screening room on the fourth floor, throwing harsh, blue-white light across the faces of the three people sitting in the plush leather chairs. On screen, Clara Hayes, an A-list actress Cedric had championed for months, was delivering a tearful, complex monologue. She was the absolute heart of the glass facade. Cedric had spent the better part of a year building the initial financing models entirely around her name and box office draw. Vesper reached over the console and hit the spacebar on his laptop. The screen froze on Clara's agonizing, tear-streaked expression. The sudden silence in the soundproofed room was deafening, save for the low hum of the projector. "She is entirely too polished," Vesper declared, leaning back and steepling his fingers in the dim light. "We are making a film about urban decay and moral ambiguity, Cedric. Clara looks like she just stepped out of a period drama. There is no grit, no danger." Cedric felt a muscle feather in his jaw. "Clara has the emotional range this script demands," he replied, keeping his voice strictly professional, measured. "More importantly, she brings the international distributors to the table. We have already discussed this at length." Vesper let out a soft, patronizing sigh, turning his head slowly toward Evelyn. It was a highly calculated move, summoning his ally to the front line. "Evelyn, you wrote the character," Vesper murmured. His voice was laced with a dark, intimate cadence that made the blood in Cedric's veins run cold. "Tell me you don't see the disconnect. We need someone feral, unpredictable. Clara is safe." Cedric shifted his gaze to his wife. Evelyn was staring at the frozen image of the actress on the screen, but her physical posture was entirely directed toward Vesper. She bit her lower lip, a nervous habit Cedric had known intimately for 7 years, before turning to face her husband. The look in her eyes was not the collaborative fire they used to share. It was strangely defensive, guarded. "Vesper has a point, Cedric," Evelyn said, her voice unervingly steady. "When I was in the Cotswolds, she did not flinch at the lie, and Cedric felt a sharp, physical ache behind his ribs. I rewrote the climax. The protagonist needs a rawness that Clara just does not possess. We need to prioritize the artistic vision over the safe financial bet." The words artistic vision hung in the stale air, a beautiful, pretentious line masking a grotesque reality. Cedric realized in that sickening moment that Vesper was not merely sleeping with Evelyn. He was asserting dominance over Cedric's territory. He was testing the boundaries, seeing exactly how much of Cedric's empire he could dismantle using the producer's own wife as his instrument. "Who do you suggest, then?" Cedric asked, his tone so devoid of emotion it sounded almost metallic. Vesper clicked a button, and a new audition tape began to play. It was a relatively unknown actress, talented perhaps, but entirely lacking the gravitas and experience required to carry a $30 million picture. But as Vesper spoke eloquently about her untapped potential, Evelyn nodded in vigorous agreement. In the shadowy darkness below the console desk, Cedric saw the subtle shift of Evelyn's knee brushing against Vesper's leg. The double betrayal sliced through Cedric with surgical precision. The woman who had built this production company with him, who had shared a twin bed in a freezing flat when they were just starting out, was actively sabotaging their life's work to appease the ego of her lover. He looked at the two of them, bathed in the cold light of the screen, united against him in his own domain. Cedric did not argue further. He did not fight for Clara. Fighting now would only expose his bleeding wounds and alert them to his awareness. He simply nodded slowly in the darkness, letting them believe they had won the creative battle, while he quietly began to draft the blueprint for the war. "Fine," Cedric said, his voice dropping to a low, hollow register. "Let us explore other options." The man sitting across from Cedric did not look like a private investigator from a gritty noir film. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, carried a slim leather briefcase, and possessed the unremarkable, forgettable face of a mid-level corporate accountant. His name was Elias, and his weekly retainer cost more than the entire lighting budget for the first week of the glass facade. It was midnight on a Thursday. The production office in Soho was dead quiet, the only illumination coming from the heavy brass desk lamp in Cedric's private suite. Elias slid a thick manila envelope across the mahogany surface. The sound of the rough paper scraping against the polished wood felt like sandpaper rubbing directly against Cedric's exposed nerves. As requested, Elias said, his voice devoid of any moral judgment or pity. 2 weeks of continuous surveillance. The Archer Hotel, as you suspected, is their primary location. Suite 402 is booked under a discreet shell company registered to Vesper. Clever, but easily traceable if you know where to look. Cedric did not immediately touch the envelope. He stared at the small brass clasp, his heart performing a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. To open it was to cross a psychological point of no return. Once he saw the objective, documented reality of his wife's infidelity, the protective numbness of his initial shock would evaporate completely. He took a slow breath, pulled the clasp back, and emptied the contents. Dozens of high-resolution photographs spilled onto the desk under the pool of yellow light. The cinematic quality of the surveillance was almost deeply ironic. There was Evelyn, wearing the vintage silk scarf Cedric had bought her in Milan, slipping through the revolving brass doors of the Archer. There was Vesper, half an hour later, casually adjusting his lapels as he entered the same opulent lobby. But the most devastating images were the ones taken through the sheer curtains of a restaurant across the street from the hotel. In a secluded, dimly lit booth, they were entirely entwined. Evelyn's head was tilted back, laughing at something Vesper had said, his hand resting intimately on the bare skin at the nape of her neck. The sheer vulnerability and unguarded joy on his wife's face, an expression Cedric had not seen directed at him in over a year, delivered a sharp, physical blow to his sternum. There is also the audio, Elias murmured, sliding a small, encrypted USB drive beside the scattered photographs. Our operative managed to clone the ambient recording from a private dining club they frequent in Mayfair. I highly recommend you listen to track 4. Cedric plugged the drive into his laptop. He put on his heavy, studio-grade headphones, isolating himself entirely in the soundscape of his own destruction. The audio was slightly muffled, the clinking of expensive crystal and low jazz bleeding into the background. Then, Evelyn's voice came through, soft, breathless, and terrifyingly familiar. Cedric is pushing back on the new budget, she sighed. Let him push, Vesper's gravelly baritone replied, a smirk audible in his tone. He's obsessed with the financial safety net. But you and I control the creative board now, Evelyn. We just need to convince the primary investors that his vision is outdated and restrictive. Once we secure the final casting approvals, his producer credit will just be a vanity title. We run this picture. Cedric closed his eyes in the dark office, gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. The audio recording was the golden ticket. This was no longer just a tragic narrative of a broken marriage. It was documented, undeniable proof of a corporate coup. Vesper was using the affair to breach Cedric's fiduciary duty to his investors, actively conspiring with Cedric's own partner to strip him of his creative and financial control. Cedric slowly removed the headphones. The agonizing ache in his chest was suddenly replaced by an icy, absolute clarity. He looked down at the photographs of his wife and her lover, no longer seeing a marriage dissolving, but two distinct liabilities that needed to be liquidated. Keep watching them, Cedric instructed Elias, carefully and methodically placing the photos back into the envelope. I need every conversation, every transaction. Build me a fortress. The annual British Independent Film Awards Gala at the Savoy was a masterclass in superficiality. 1,000 glittering smiles, air kisses, and strategic networking sessions masked the cutthroat reality of the industry. Cedric and Evelyn were the golden couple of the evening, navigating the opulent, chandelier-lit ballroom with practiced ease. Evelyn wore a stunning, backless emerald gown that caught the flashbulbs of the press pit perfectly. Cedric, in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, kept his hand lightly on the small of her back, a possessive, protective gesture that felt to him like touching a hot stove. He was performing the role of his life. You look absolutely radiant tonight, darling, a prominent distributor remarked, handing Evelyn a flute of champagne. The buzz around the glass facade is deafening. You two must be exhausted. It's a labor of love, truly, Edelin replied smoothly, leaning slightly into Cedric's side. The scent of her expensive perfume, the very one she wore to the Archer Hotel, wafted over him, thick and cloying. But Cedric is the anchor. He handles the storms so I can focus on the story. Cedric smiled, a perfectly calculated, affectionate expression that didn't reach his eyes. We make a good team, he said, raising his glass in a polite toast. The champagne tasted like ash. Across the crowded room, near the towering ice sculpture at the Raw Bar, stood Vesper. He was holding court with a group of young, eager actors, his dark, tailored suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the shimmering backdrop. Cedric watched him with the detached focus of a sniper. The tension in Cedric's shoulders was agonizing. He was hyper-aware of the invisible, electric wire connecting his wife to the casting director across the sea of tuxedos and ball gowns. It started with a subtle shift in Edelin's body language. As she laughed politely at a producer's joke, she slowly, deliberately turned her torso exactly 10 degrees to the right. It was a microscopic adjustment, but Cedric, who had spent a decade analyzing her every move, noticed instantly. Her eyes darted over the rim of her champagne glass, cutting through the crowd like a laser, landing squarely on Vesper. Vesper paused mid-sentence. He didn't look back immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his bourbon, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto Edelin's. It was a fleeting, magnetic connection, a private, silent conversation amidst 100 loud ones. The corner of Vesper's mouth twitched into a smirk, an arrogant acknowledgement of their secret. A slow, cold fury twisted in Cedric's gut. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They were flaunting their betrayal in a room filled with the most powerful people in London, right under his nose. He felt a violent urge to cross the floor, grab Vesper by his tailored lapels, and shatter the heavy crystal glass against the bar. The fantasy flared bright and destructive in his mind for a split second. Patience, he reminded himself, gripping his glass tighter. The final cut is the only one that matters. Excuse me for a moment, Edelin murmured softly, her hand lightly brushing Cedric's arm. I need to powder my nose. Of course, Cedric replied, his voice a steady, calm hum. He watched her weave through the crowd toward the grand marble staircase leading to the restrooms. He counted to 30. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Vesper detach himself from his admiring circle and head casually toward the heavy velvet curtains that led to the smoking terrace, a route that conveniently intersected the hallway to the restrooms. Cedric did not follow them. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening in the shadowy alcove by the cloakroom. He could almost feel the hurried, desperate touch, the hushed whispers of stolen intimacy while the orchestra played a sweeping waltz in the ballroom. He stood alone in the center of the glittering gala, a man entirely surrounded by people, drowning in a profound, suffocating isolation. He raised his glass to the empty air, saluting the ghosts of a marriage that was already dead, preparing for the war that was about to begin. The law offices of Sterling and Croft were located in a brutalist tower overlooking the Thames, far from the artistic, chaotic energy of Soho. The conference room was soundproofed, aggressively air-conditioned, and devoid of anything resembling warmth. It was the perfect environment for a dissection. Cedric sat across from Eleanor Croft, a divorce attorney whose reputation in London's upper echelons was forged in the bloodless dissolution of high-net-worth marriages. She didn't deal in emotions. She dealt in leverage, equity, and absolute devastation. You understand, Mr. Vance, Eleanor began, her voice a precise, metallic clip as she adjusted her reading glasses, that in a standard dissolution, given the length of the marriage and your joint ownership of the production company, your wife would be entitled to half of all current and future assets. This includes the intellectual property rights to the glass facade. Cedric felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The thought of Edelin and Vesper profiting from the film he had bled for over the last 2 years was a physical sickness. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the desecration of his legacy. That is unacceptable, Cedric stated, his tone as sharp and unyielding as the edge of a scalpel. He pushed a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. Which is why I hired Elias. Eleanor opened the folder, her expression remaining perfectly neutral as she scanned the high-resolution photographs of Evelyn and Vesper and the detailed transcripts of their encrypted conversations. She paused on the financial analysis Elias had uncovered regarding Vesper's shell company and the hotel charges. Infidelity is messy, but it doesn't necessarily change the math of a corporate split in a no-fault divorce, Eleanor pointed out, tapping a manicured fingernail against the dossier. However, what you have here isn't just an affair. It's a breach of fiduciary duty. Cedric leaned forward, the exhaustion of the past month momentarily eclipsed by the sharp focus of a predator. Explain. Your wife is actively conspiring with a contracted employee, Mr. Vesper, to undermine the financial viability of your joint venture, Eleanor explained, pulling out the transcript of the audio recording from the private dining club. She is colluding to remove you from creative control and alter casting decisions that directly impact the film's pre-sale distribution value, solely to benefit her lover's professional standing. That is corporate sabotage. A grim satisfaction settled over Cedric. He had suspected as much, but hearing it articulated by a ruthless legal mind solidified his strategy. We need to structure a buyout, Eleanor continued, her eyes gleaming with the calculating chill of a seasoned general. Before we file for divorce, you will initiate a restructuring of the production company's holding assets. We use a subsidiary clause, one that Evelyn, frankly, rarely reviews closely as she focuses on the artistic side of the business. You will transfer the primary IP rights of the glass facade into a newly formed LLC under your sole control. Won't she have to sign off on that? Cedric asked, the tension returning to his jaw. Evelyn was distracted. Yes, but she wasn't entirely naive. Yes, but she will sign it as part of a larger, seemingly routine tax mitigation strategy, Eleanor replied, sliding a dense stack of legal documents toward him. You present it as a boring, necessary bureaucratic hurdle to secure the final round of investor funding. Given her current preoccupations with Mr. Vesper, she will likely sign without cross-examining the fine print, trusting your financial acumen as she always has. Cedric stared at the documents. They represented the methodical, legal assassination of his marriage. For 7 years, they had built this empire together, signing every contract side by side. Now, he was laying a trap in the very paperwork that was meant to protect them. The betrayal cut deep, but the necessity of survival cut deeper. He picked up the heavy, silver Mont Blanc pen, the very one he had been looking for the night he found the hotel receipt, and began to sign his name, executing the cold, silent war that would leave Evelyn with nothing but the ashes of her own making. The air in the Dean Street production office was stale, heavy with the suffocating humidity of a late July afternoon and the palpable, toxic energy radiating from the conference table. Cedric sat motionless, his expression an impenetrable mask, while Evelyn paced nervously by the frosted glass windows. Vesper occupied the chair usually reserved for the lead financier, his posture a masterclass in relaxed, predatory confidence. It's entirely unprecedented, Cedric, Vesper began, his smooth baritone cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. He slid a slim, embossed folder across the mahogany table. The casting process for the glass facade has evolved beyond simple selection. I've fundamentally restructured the narrative arcs through the talent we've secured. A standard casting director credit no longer reflects my contribution. Cedric didn't look at the folder. He looked at Evelyn. She had stopped pacing and was currently attempting to look anywhere but at her husband. Her silence was a deafening endorsement of her lover's ambition. You are asking for an executive producer credit, Cedric stated, his voice devoid of any inflection, a flat, dangerous calm that he had meticulously rehearsed in front of a mirror that morning. On a film where you have contributed zero capital and hold no intellectual property rights. Vesper leaned forward, interlacing his fingers, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. I am asking for acknowledgement of the creative heavy lifting, Cedric, The investors are thrilled with the new, edgier direction. They understand the value I'm bringing to the table. The audacity was breathtaking. Vesper was not merely sleeping with Cedric's wife. He was actively attempting to rewrite the history of Cedric's life's work, attempting to insert himself into the very DNA of the project. Cedric felt a violent, visceral urge to lunge across the table, to shatter the smug certainty on Vesper's face. Patience, he reminded himself, the mantra repeating like a slow, steady drumbeat in his skull. The paperwork is almost finished. The trap is almost set. Edelin, Cedric said quietly, turning his gaze entirely on his wife. The weight of his stare forced her to finally look at him. As the writer, how do you feel about this significant shift in the production hierarchy? Edelin hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to Vesper before settling back on Cedric. There was a flicker of guilt, quickly extinguished by the cold, calculating ambition she had recently developed. Vesper has elevated the material, Cedric, she said, her voice tight, defensive. The new cast brings a raw energy we were lacking. It's only fair that his title reflects the scope of his influence. The betrayal was complete. She was actively assisting in his professional execution. Cedric absorbed the blow without a flinch. He slowly exhaled, a calculated sigh of a man conceding a hard-fought battle. The distributors will push back, Cedric offered, a final, token resistance to make his capitulation believable. Adding an untested producer to the masthead this late in pre-production sends a signal of instability. I can handle the distributors, Vesper countered smoothly, leaning back, savoring his perceived victory. My relationships in this town are extensive. Cedric stared at the embossed folder containing Vesper's revised contract. It was a vile piece of paper, a monument to their arrogance and his own humiliation. But it was also the final piece of bait he needed. Very well, Cedric said softly, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. He reached out and pulled the folder toward him. I will have legal review the terms. If it doesn't violate our primary financing agreements, we will proceed with the amendment. Vesper's smile widened, a triumphant smirk that Edelin returned with a subtle, relieved exhale. They believed they had won. They believed Cedric was a weak, easily manipulated obstacle they had successfully bypassed. Cedric opened his heavy, silver Mont-Blanc pen, the very instrument he was using to quietly sever his financial ties to Edelin, and made a small, meaningless checkmark on Vesper's proposal. The war was no longer cold. It was about to go nuclear, and they were entirely oblivious to the countdown. The private dining room at the Wolseley was an oak-paneled sanctuary of high finance and discreet power, a world away from the gritty artistic posturing of Soho. It was 8 a.m. on a crisp October morning, the air thick with the smell of expensive coffee and the quiet hum of immense wealth. Cedric sat at the head of a small, polished table across from Marcus Thorne, the lead venture capitalist backing the glass facade. Thorne was a man who communicated in risk assessments and return on investment. He had no patience for the tempestuous egos of the film industry, only for the bottom line. You requested this breakfast rather urgently, Cedric, Thorne noted, slicing a piece of toast with surgical precision. I trust the production schedule hasn't encountered another artistic delay. The schedule is robust, Marcus, Cedric replied, his tone exactly calibrated to convey professional concern rather than panic. He took a slow sip of his espresso, his heart rate steady, perfectly controlled. However, a significant liability has emerged regarding our casting director, Vesper. Thorne paused, his silver eyebrows knitting together. Vesper? The man Edelin insisted we bring on board to elevate the international appeal? What sort of liability? Cedric didn't reach for his briefcase immediately. He let the silence stretch for a calculated beat, establishing the gravity of the situation. He was about to execute a flawless corporate assassination, and the setup had to be immaculate. He could not afford to look like a spurned husband. He had to remain the vigilant, ruthless protector of the investor's capital. As you know, Vesper has aggressively restructured our lead roles over the past month, Cedric began, his voice low, confidential. He recently demanded an executive producer credit, claiming his relationships were vital to the new direction. I found the timing and the sudden shift in our talent pool concerning. Cedric opened his briefcase and produced a single, unbranded manila folder. It contained none of the high-resolution photographs of his wife at the Archer Hotel, none of the devastating audio recordings of her breathless laughter. Instead, it held the meticulously sanitized intelligence Elias had gathered regarding Vesper's professional conduct. He slid the folder across the crisp white tablecloth. I initiated a discreet compliance audit, Cedric explained smoothly, watching Thorne open the file. What you are looking at is documented evidence of a clear conflict of interest and, frankly, systemic blackmail. Thorne's eyes scanned the first page, his expression hardening. The documents detailed Vesper's private shell company, the same one he used to book Suite 402, and a series of exorbitant consultation fees paid into it by 3 distinct, mid-level talent agencies. These were the exact agencies representing the relatively unknown, edgy actors Vesper had aggressively championed to replace Cedric's established A-list choices. He is taking kickbacks, Thorne stated flatly, the wealthy veneer dropping to reveal a cold, predatory anger. More than that, Cedric corrected softly. He tapped a secondary document, a sworn, anonymous affidavit Elias had secured from a young actress Vesper had abruptly cut from the film. He is actively removing talent who refuse his private stipulations and replacing them with actors whose agencies are financially compensating him through his offshore LLC. He is treating the glass facade as his personal ATM, directly compromising the commercial viability of the project to line his own pockets. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware from the main restaurant. Thorne closed the folder, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked visibly. Does Edlin know about this? Thorne demanded, his gaze piercing. Cedric met his eyes without flinching, delivering the lie with chilling perfection. Edlin is entirely focused on the script revisions. She trusted Vesper's creative instincts, as we all did initially. I felt it imperative to bring this to the board before discussing it internally, to contain the legal exposure. Thorne nodded slowly, a grim approval settling over his features. Cedric had played it perfectly. He had isolated the cancer without damaging the healthy tissue of his own reputation. This is a gross violation of his contract, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We cannot have a blackmailer attached to a $30 million property. The distributors will devour us if this leaks. My thoughts exactly, Cedric agreed, slipping the folder back into his briefcase. He felt no triumph, only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a trap snapping shut. I need the board's authorization to terminate Vesper immediately, with cause, and to quietly inform his agency representation of our findings to ensure he doesn't retaliate. Thorne picked up his napkin, the breakfast entirely forgotten. You have it. Gut him, Cedric. Before the end of the day. The rain had returned to London, a cold, relentless drizzle that mirrored the icy tension inside the Dean Street production office. It was 4 p.m., and the news of Vesper's imminent termination had not yet officially broken, but the oppressive silence in the air suggested a storm was about to hit. Cedric sat at his desk, meticulously reviewing the final legal transfer of the glass facade IP to his newly formed LLC. He was a ghost in his own company, executing a flawless, invisible plan. He didn't look up when the heavy oak door to his office swung open and Edlin rushed in, closing it sharply behind her. She looked frantic. The poised, untouchable writer who had confidently demanded Vesper's promotion only days ago was gone. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she carried a tense, electric panic that filled the room. Cedric, she began, her voice a tight, high-pitched wire. Have you spoken to Marcus Thorne today? Cedric slowly placed his silver Montblanc pen beside the stack of legal documents. He didn't flinch. He didn't react to the desperation in her tone. He simply looked at her, his expression a calm, unreadable mask. Marcus and I speak regularly, Edlin. He replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. He is our lead investor. Is there a problem? Edelyn paced the short distance between his desk and the window, her hands trembling slightly. She turned back to him, her eyes wide, searching his face for any sign of complicity. "Vesper called me," she admitted, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "He said his agency representation just contacted him. They're dropping him. All of them. There's a rumor spreading like wildfire that he's being investigated for kickbacks on our film." Cedric felt a cold, dark satisfaction unspool in his chest, a stark contrast to the agonizing ache he had felt months ago when he first discovered the hotel receipt. He had orchestrated this perfectly. He was watching the demolition of his enemy, and his wife was the one delivering the news. "Kickbacks," Cedric repeated, his voice laced with exactly the right amount of professional concern and mild surprise. "That is a serious accusation. If there is any truth to it, Marcus would certainly be involved." "It's a lie," Edelyn insisted fiercely, but her eyes betrayed a sudden, sickening doubt. She stepped closer to his desk, her voice pleading. "Cedric, you know Vesper. You know his artistic integrity. Someone is trying to destroy him. We have to defend him. If he goes down, he could drag the entire casting process, our entire vision, down with him." Cedric watched her closely. She was terrified. Not for the film, he realized with a sharp, cynical clarity. She was terrified that her lover, the man she had sacrificed her marriage for, was not the powerful, untouchable force he claimed to be. She was realizing she had anchored her ship to a sinking rock. "If Vesper has engaged in financial misconduct, Edelyn, he is a liability to the investors," Cedric stated flatly, his tone devoid of any emotion. "I cannot protect a liability. My responsibility is to the picture." Edelyn stopped pacing. The cold reality of his words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, really looking at him for the first time in months. She saw the impenetrable wall he had built, the chilling detachment he now wielded like a weapon. The sudden panic in her eyes shifted to a desperate, calculating need for security. She moved around the desk, reaching out to place her hand over his. The touch, once so familiar and comforting, now felt repulsive, a parasitic attempt to siphon his strength. "Cedric, please," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "We have worked so hard for this. We built this company together. You are the only one who can navigate the board. Talk to Marcus. Tell him Vesper is essential. I don't know what I would do if this falls apart. We need each other right now." It was a profound, devastating moment. She was actively using their shared history, their marriage, as a shield to protect the man she was sleeping with. She was reaching for a safety net that Cedric had already quietly cut to shreds. He looked down at her hand resting on his, then slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand away. "The board has already made their decision, Edelyn," Cedric said quietly, his voice a soft, final death knell. "Vesper is out, and I strongly suggest you distance yourself from him before the fallout tarnishes your reputation as a writer." The following morning, the atmosphere in the Dean Street office was suffocating, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a violent storm. Cedric sat perfectly still at the head of the heavy oak conference table, his posture an immovable, terrifying calm. To his right sat Marcus Thorne, the lead investor, his face set in a grim, unforgiving lines of corporate execution. Edelyn was notably absent. Cedric had ensured she was scheduled for an urgent wardrobe fitting across town. He wanted this bloodletting contained. The heavy glass door swung open, and Vesper strode in. He was dressed in his usual impeccable dark suit, radiating a predatory arrogance, entirely unaware he was walking into an ambush. He carried the embossed folder containing his demands for an executive producer credit. "Gentlemen," Vesper greeted smoothly, taking the seat opposite Cedric. He flashed a confident, patronizing smile at Thorne. "I assume we are finalizing the new contractual terms." Cedric didn't return the smile. He placed a single, thick manila envelope onto the center of the table. It landed with a soft, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. "We are finalizing your departure, Vesper," Cedric stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was a cold, precise surgical strike. Vesper's smile vanished instantly. His eyes darted from the envelope to Cedric, then to Thorn, processing the sudden shift in power. He sat up straighter, the arrogant facade slipping to reveal a sharp, defensive edge. "Excuse me," Vesper demanded, his smooth baritone dropping to a dangerous growl. "Is this a joke, Cedric? I single-handedly restructured the creative vision of this picture. You cannot run the glass facade without my casting choices." "That is exactly why you are being terminated," Thorn interjected, his voice like cracking ice. The venture capitalist slid the manila envelope across the table toward Vesper. "We have conducted a thorough compliance audit of your external LLCs." Vesper stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. He didn't touch it. "Inside," Cedric continued, his tone a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of facts, "you will find documented evidence of kickbacks from 3 mid-level talent agencies. You will also find a sworn affidavit from a former lead actress detailing your extortion tactics. You have treated this $30 million production as a personal slush fund. Vesper, you are in direct violation of your contract." The color drained entirely from Vesper's face. The sheer volume of evidence, presented so clinically, was devastating. He had underestimated the quiet, methodical producer he had so easily cuckolded. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that Cedric had not been passively accepting his demands. He had been meticulously building a gallows. But Vesper was a creature of Soho, a shark accustomed to bleeding in the water. Cornered and stripped of his professional leverage, he reached for his final, most toxic weapon. His eyes locked onto Cedric, blazing with a desperate, vicious malice. "You think you've won, Cedric?" Vesper sneered, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He ignored Thorn entirely, aiming his venom directly at the husband he had humiliated. "You think you can just throw me out? If I go down, I am taking this entire project with me. I will go to the press. I will tell them exactly why you're firing me. I will tell them about Edlin." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the moment Vesper believed he held the ultimate trump card, the threat of public humiliation that would destroy Cedric's marriage and scandalize the film's production. Cedric didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact. He simply let out a slow, terrifyingly calm breath. "You mean," Cedric replied softly, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room, "the affair you've been having with my wife at the Archer Hotel? Suite 402? The vintage champagne?" Vesper recoiled as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shock of Cedric's absolute, chilling awareness paralyzed him. "I have known for months, Vesper," Cedric continued, the icy detachment in his voice finally cracking to reveal a sliver of the cold, calculated fury beneath. He opened a smaller, encrypted folder on his tablet and turned the screen toward the casting director. On the screen was a high-resolution photograph of Vesper and Edlin, intimately entwined in the private dining booth across from the Archer. Next to it was the audio file of their conversation plotting to remove Cedric's creative control. "I am not firing you because you slept with my wife," Cedric said, his tone dropping to a deadly, quiet register. "I am firing you because you are a thief and a liability to my investors. If you speak a single word to the press about Edlin or about this production, I will release this entire dossier to every major studio and agency in London. You will never work in this industry again." Cedric leaned back, the execution complete. He looked at the shattered, utterly defeated man across the table. "Get out of my office." The rain over Soho had finally stopped, leaving the neon signs bleeding onto the wet pavement below the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment. It was 9 p.m. The silence in the sprawling, minimalist living room was no longer the comfortable quiet of a shared life. It was the suffocating stillness of a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Cedric stood by the heavy oak dining table, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He had not poured a drink. He had not changed out of his suit. He was waiting for the final act. The front door clicked open, and Edlin stepped into the foyer. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the day's wardrobe crisis having worn off, replaced by a lingering, nervous energy regarding Vesper's sudden silence. She dropped her designer bag onto the console table and walked into the living room, stopping abruptly when she saw Cedric's rigid posture. "Cedric?" she asked, her voice tentative, a thread of apprehension weaving through the single word. "You're home late. Did you speak to Marcus about the rumors?" Cedric turned to face her. The emotional detachment he had wielded like a shield for months was gone, replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The gravity of what he was about to do required absolute precision. "There are no rumors, Edlin," he said, his voice flat and steady. "Vesper was terminated for cause this morning. The board was unanimous." Edlin froze, the color draining from her face. Her eyes widened, a frantic, desperate calculation flashing across her features. She took a step forward, her hands raising slightly in a defensive gesture. "Terminated?" she echoed, her voice breathless. "But the casting? Our vision? Cedric, you can't just let them—" "I didn't let them, Edlin. I orchestrated it," Cedric cut in, his words slicing through her panic with surgical precision. He moved to the dining table and picked up a thick, immaculate manila folder. He didn't hand it to her. He dropped it onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room, identical to the sound of Vesper's career ending hours earlier. "What is this?" Edlin whispered, her gaze fixed on the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "That," Cedric replied softly, "is the end of the narrative you and Vesper have been writing for the past 6 months." Edlin hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out and opened the cover. The first thing she saw was the high-resolution photograph of herself, laughing intimately with Vesper in the dimly lit booth across from the Archer Hotel. Beneath it was the receipt for Suite 402, the vintage champagne, the crisp documentation of her betrayal. A sharp, choked gasp escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, dropping the folder. The photos spilled across the table, undeniable, grotesque proof of her infidelity laid bare under the harsh pendant lights. "Cedric." She stammered, the poised, articulate writer entirely obliterated. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "You knew. You knew this whole time." "I knew," Cedric confirmed, the ice in his voice cracking to reveal the raw, agonizing wound beneath. "I found the receipt the night you returned from your retreat in the Cotswolds. I watched you sit in our office and actively sabotage the film we built together to stroke his ego. I listened to the audio recordings of you plotting to strip my producer credit so you could control the picture with him." Edlin physically recoiled, her hands flying to her mouth. The sheer magnitude of his awareness, the terrifying silence he had maintained while she confidently destroyed their life, crashed over her. She was not the master manipulator. She had been the unwitting star of a tragedy he was directing. "I am so sorry," she sobbed, tears finally spilling over, raw and panicked. She lunged toward him, desperate to close the physical distance, to find the man who had loved her. "It was a mistake. He manipulated me, Cedric. He used the film to— Please, we can fix this. We built this company." Cedric stepped back, her touch repulsing him violently. He picked up a second, thinner envelope from the table and held it out to her. It was stark white, bearing the emblem of Sterling and Croft. "We didn't build a company, Edlin. You built a lie," Cedric said, his voice dropping to a harsh, final whisper. "These are the divorce papers, and the legal transfer of the glass facade IP to My Soul LLC, which you signed last week under the guise of tax mitigation." Edlin stared at the white envelope, the absolute finality of his revenge sinking in. She had lost her lover to a scandal she had helped create. She had lost her marriage to a man she had deeply underestimated. And she had signed away the very masterpiece she had sacrificed everything to control. She was left standing in the ruins of her own ambition, completely and utterly alone. The darkness of the private screening room at the British Film Institute was absolute, save for the massive, silver screen projecting the final moments of the glass facade. It was 6 months after the divorce papers had been served, 6 months since Cedric had methodically erased Edlin Vance and Vesper from his life and his production company. The theater was entirely empty, save for Cedric sitting dead center in the plush, velvet seats. On screen, Clara Hayes, The actress Vesper had tried so desperately to cut, delivered a performance that would inevitably define her career and secure the film's international distribution. The cinematography was stark, the emotional resonance devastating. It was precisely the masterpiece Cedric had envisioned from the beginning. It was a critical and commercial triumph, a testament to his unyielding control as a producer. The credits began to roll, white text scrolling silently against a pitch-black background. Produced by Cedric Vance. There was no co-producer credit. There was no mention of Edlin's artistic vision, save for a contractual story by attribution buried deep in the technical scroll, a legal necessity he could not entirely erase. Vesper's name, naturally, was entirely absent, replaced by the diligent, uncredited assistant who had actually finalized the contracts. Cedric sat motionless as the soaring, melancholic score swelled through the surround sound system. The air in the theater was cold, sterile. He had won. He had protected his investors, secured his intellectual property, and executed a flawless, public humiliation of the man who had tried to steal his wife and his legacy. Edlin had moved to a small flat in Brooklyn, her reputation in London's tight-knit indie scene irreparably damaged by the quiet, pervasive rumors of her complicity in Vesper's corporate sabotage. Vesper himself had quietly relocated to Los Angeles, a pariah in the British casting community. Cedric had successfully directed the tragedy of his own life, ensuring the villains faced the ultimate consequence while he emerged as the sole architect of the film's success. Yet, as the final copyright notice faded from the screen, leaving him entirely in the dark, the victory tasted like ash. He didn't feel the surge of vindication he had anticipated during those agonizing nights staring at the hotel receipt. He didn't feel the triumphant release he had imagined when he handed Edlin the sterling and Croft envelope. He felt only a profound, echoing emptiness. For 7 years, this screening room would have been filled with their shared exhilaration. Edlin would have been sitting next to him, her hand gripping his in the dark as they watched their collective dream materialize on screen. They would have celebrated with vintage champagne, not the kind ordered to Suite 402, but the kind they drank on the floor of their first freezing flat in Soho. Now, he was the sole owner of a $30 million masterpiece, completely isolated by the very walls he had built to protect it. The revenge had been necessary for his survival, both professional and personal, but the cost of the war was the complete devastation of the landscape he had fought so hard to defend. He had excised the cancer, but in doing so, he had cut away the heart of his own life. The projector shut off with a soft, definitive click, plunging the room into total silence. Cedric slowly stood up, the leather of his seat groaning slightly in the quiet. He buttoned his tailored jacket, staring at the blank, silver screen for a long, heavy moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling past the unread congratulatory messages from Marcus Thorne and the distributors. He opened his gallery, found the encrypted folder containing the photographs of Edlin and Vesper at the Archer Hotel, and pressed delete. He didn't need the evidence anymore. The reality of his new life was proof enough. Cedric turned and began the long walk up the carpeted aisle toward the glowing red exit sign. The final cut is always the most painful, he whispered to the empty theater, the sound swallowed immediately by the silence. But it's the only way the picture makes sense.